We can just go to Jason. Would that be appropriate? And let Jason start up and go for it.
Can you hear me all? Can you give me thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay.
I think we're good. I'm going to be back by the camera for you, Jason, just to be able to kind of cue you on what's going on. But I'm in the back of everybody's head, so.
That's great.
But we'll keep. But otherwise, you're on.
Okay. Well, let me say this. Thanks for letting me jump in on this day of yours. If there are questions, I am going to download a whole bunch of information in the next 45 minutes to sort of have you think about. And when I start going, it's just going to start coming. And so I guess if there are questions you have, or there's something you don't understand, something you want me to elaborate on, or you want to push back on, if Bob, if you could be that person, maybe you could just, if you see someone raise their hand, you could sort of, because I can't hear, and if for some reason the sound goes out, stand up and let me know too. So, okay, well, let's get started. Again, my name is Jason Santos. I have been a student of youth and young adult spirituality for the last probably 25 years, either as a minister, as a volunteer, as a staff person, as a pastor, and as a theologian. And really addressing this topic didn't really come out on accident, but it actually, the presentation or the information that we're talking about today actually sort of came out about 2 years ago when I was at a Big Tent event, which is the event that the national office does in between GAs. And I had to fill in for someone who was teaching about young adult spirituality. And I stepped into it, and I sort of just had to throw something together. And really, that was kind of the basis of the first time I was forced in about 5-10 minutes to sort of throw together something and step into a situation. So, but over the last 2 years, it's developed and it's grown. And so, really, the question that we begin with when we ask this question about intergenerationality is a problem. And the problem that we're finding is that young adults are no longer in our churches. Yes, we have a smattering of them, but by and large, they have shown their distrust for institutional Christianity. They feel like we're not an effective organization or a system of thought. And so not that they're not spiritual, but they just don't really want to be a part of it. So they say, we're done. We don't have to be there. No one's making us go. Our parents didn't make us go when we were teens. They're not going to make us go now, so we're just going to leave. And this throws the church into a tizzy because we say, oh my gosh, if we don't have young people in the church, how are we going to sustain this institution called the Presbyterian denomination? Well, the first thing I would say is, one, we're not a dying church, we're an aging church. And by that I mean that, that the larger portion of our church, the larger portion of givers in our church are really in the last third of their lives. The middle third are still continuing to sustain us, but those in the first third of their lives really aren't contributing much to the project. So, and when they're not there in numbers or they're in dollars, we start to say, hey, we're not going to survive. But I have good news, and that is we are going to survive. There's lots of money in the Presbyterian Church. We just need to pull together and figure out actually how we use best for the future of the church. And I firmly believe that intergenerational ministry is at the core of that. And in order to really unpack what this means, I'd like you to sort of, we're going to walk a little bit through generational theory. We're going to look at cultural changes in the church over the last really 50 to 80 years. And then I want to look at a few identity formation theories that sort of contribute to this understanding of why intergenerational ministry is so important to actually how we do faith and how we form our young people in the faith, not for the sake of sustaining the church, but for the sake of being the body of Christ and living faithfully. When we fail to pass on that faith, that conviction, that life to our children and to our youth, then we are failing to do the very thing that Scripture tells us to do, which is train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. And so at the core of what we're talking about is, what does it mean to train up a child in the way they should go? What does it mean to raise a child in a Christian home? So let's take a step back, and first thing I would like you to do to sort of frame it is to say, we're looking really at and if anyone's read Phyllis Tickle's, late Phyllis Tickle's book, The Great Emergence, that really sums it up well. It gives a short history of the church, but really if we're looking at the turning points of the church, you look at sort of 500-year blocks. So you have Christ died, you have Constantinian Christianity established in the 4th century, and then you have sort of this degradation of culture to the extent that it caused St. Benedict to go up into the mountains and start a new form of spirituality that was like leaving the city behind. And that spirituality through Gregory the Great actually launched throughout Western Europe for the next probably 1100, 1200 years that followed. But Benedictine spirituality, until really the Enlightenment, has guided Christian spirituality. And we often think of Benedictines as Catholics, but they're not. They predate Catholicism by almost 1,000 years. And so what happened is that then 500 years later, you have this great split, the great schism in the 11th century between the East and the West. And then where we came from, the Great Reformation splits in the 1500s. And now Phyllis Tickle argues that we're in a shift in society, culture, to the extent that we're on the cusp or in the middle or the beginning of that shift. We haven't in the middle by any means. And part of what brought that out is that we're also in the last century, we see the beginning of a new era in culture called postmodernity, where all those old ideals that came from the Enlightenment, that came from the Reformation, that said science is right, we need proof for God's existence, apologetics makes this day and age where personal experience is what actually allows someone to connect.
Jason, can you back up with that last paragraph, because we lost a connection point in there and kind of lost half the words.
What was the last thing I said?
What you just said in the last 2 sentences, just go back through that again.
Oh, okay.
The most recent 500 years, yeah.
The last 500 years, in 1700s, you know, we have, and really it's this rise of individualism over the last 1700s. When the minute the Reformation, you could argue, was caused by the Gutenberg press invention. All of a sudden we could print Bibles, literacy became more popular. People started reading the Bibles and they're like, I don't need a priest to mediate this for me. And we've seen this bifurcation and the splitting and the splintering that has gone on through our culture for the last almost 600 years now, through that of the splintering. And so all that brings us to the last century, where we see this shift around 1950, really is where sociologists would roughly estimate it, where we have this shift from the things that were solid and right and certain to a space where all knowledge is relative. All knowledge is based on personal experience.
Okay, we just froze up on personal experience.
About who you connect with is more akin to the early church. So did I break again?
Just where you said personal experience, then you froze up. So,
hey Bob, if I freeze, just hold your hand up in that screen, because you all aren't freezing. Then I'll know I need to stop. Okay, does that work?
Yeah, I'll get in front of it.
So we come to the last 50 years. We're in the middle of this postmodern shift where everything goes from concrete to the last 4 generations: the silent generation, the boomer generation, the Xers, and the millennials. And we still haven't defined this current generation, which, you know, homeland generation or whatever they're calling it. So we're not going to talk about them, as they aren't really a generation as defined yet. But generational theory came out in the 80s by William Strauss and Neil Howe, and they basically argued that every 20-some years there's a shift in how culture and generations push against one another and act. And that's something that they trace back to the 1400s. Ironically, not surprising, considering it comes around the time of the development of the Gutenberg press, because it's when we started to fracture that understanding of communal identity and begin to see bits and bits of individualism pop up. Not entirely a bad thing, but comes with challenges. So let's look at the last 4 generations, the silent generation. And by generation, I'm going to chunk these into decades, but they really are more nuanced than that. But the easiest way to think of them is the silent generation is from around 1920 to 1940. So the Great Depression was there, the Prohibition was there, sandwiched between wars and in the midst of one, in the heart of it. It was a tumultuous time, and the individuals that came up through that, the silent generation came through that, were sturdy, were strong, they were survivors. But they really didn't have the cultural or generational momentum to do anything, because we as a culture were sort of in a place of waiting and holding. So They really didn't speak their voices. There was no social reform. We were all sort of collateral damage to the larger game that was being played on a national level and on a global level. So we named them the Silent Generation. They're known for being hard workers. They're known for their communal ethos. They're known for their morality. They see things as black and white. It's the last remnants of modernity that said there is a right and a wrong. There is something that you should do. There's a moral imperative that is in us. And so they existed in this space, and they understood church in this way. The church was associated with good citizenship. If you were a good citizen, you went to church. If you were a good Christian, you participated in society, and you worked to build a better society, because there was a rebuilding that was going on, in particular in the last, between 1940 and 1950, there was that rebuilding notion of we have to rebuild our nation. So solid folk doing their, and then the early Silent Generation sort of had the first round of the last round of boomers. They kind of overlap. So boomers go from Boomer generation was interesting because they came about in a time.
Yeah, just start again. Oh, now you're frozen up good. You need to blink or something because, anyway, no, you're just frozen. Hang in there. Just wait.
Back on track?
No, he's trying to get it.
I can't hear you.
Well, you're,
okay.
Vocally you're okay. Now you're a little bit back on track.
Okay.
Just, you finished with the Silent Generation. You were just starting with the next sort of wave. Boomers.
The boomers came about. You want me to start?
Yeah, now you go.
Okay, the boomers came out and they were born in an era of massive shift and change. There were a number of things that caused that. There was a psychological boom that sort of started in the 1930s, 40s, and led up into the 1980s, where there's the proliferation of psychological scholarship and literature, developmental psychology, the recognition that people learn different, all these things were bubbling up. And what that has the effect is that it differentiates people. No longer do we all learn the same. No longer do we all think the same. Each of us are our own unique individuals. Well, this was coded into the ethos of the mindset of boomers that said, hey, we can change this institution that we're trying to build. We can be innovative. We can be empowered. We can change society. And that's exactly what they did. Hence, you get civil rights, the challenging of racial prejudice. You get women's suffrage and women's rights, the equality within sex. You get sexual revolution that says sex just isn't about procreation, that there's a much wider spectrum there. And so you see all of these areas, and really what it boils down to is when you take it off the focus of the whole and you put it on the focus of the little individual rocking around here, then you get a better understanding that the boomer generation came about when there was a sense of personhood in a way that there wasn't prior to that generation. Because pop psychology, self-help, a therapeutic generation that said the actualization of the individual was the most important thing. That sort of characterized that. But then when you tack on the development of technology, when you tack on industry, when you tack on the fact that society as a whole was doing better, you get a boom in the economy, not only in the children, not only in the psychological realm, but you get an economic realm and financial realm. And so you could say of the last century, the highest point was the high point of boomer culture, because there was lots of money to go around and there was lots of innovation. It was a great time in life to be, there's lots of change, and if you embraced it, it was great. So the boomers' children, the Xers, came about, you can sort of gauge them from 60 to 80, and they came out and they were called the latchkey kids. They were the ones who came home to no one were at home and let themselves in with a key, and the television became their surrogate parent. Why? Well, because a lot of factors played into that. You had two parents working at the time because the economy was booming. Women could now work in the workplace in a way that they couldn't 20, 30 years ago. And as a consequence, Xers grew up with this sense of that no parental figure. We were left to our own devices. We could do what we want. And so we sort of have this deistic view of God and of our parents, and that we sort of are just scrappers, and that's where you get some of that grunge culture. That's where you get the pessimism that comes out of the Xers. That's where you get the deconstruction. We were the first to say, we don't trust this institution. We don't trust the institution. Actually, what we said is we don't trust the institution that the boomers are building. We bought into it for a bit, but then eventually we just had this sense of distrust because we didn't trust religious institutions at all. So what you have is you have all these different characteristics, and I'm going to argue that they actually tapped into the millennial generation, which the National Study of Youth and Religion is doing a longitudinal study that is launched a book in 2005 and 2010 and 2015. They're following the same cohorts through and studying spirituality of youth and young adults. And in doing so, what they found amongst a lot of results was that the dominating, they learned two main things. One, as mainline Protestant Christians, we're doing a miserable job of handing down our faith. Our young people have no vocabulary of faith. They don't have an allegiance to our faith. We have failed in the process of giving them what they need in order to sustain or to be a part of the community that we call church. They don't want to be a part of it. Two, Chris Smith, the leader of the researcher of the national study, said that that the religion that we did pass down is called moral therapeutic deism, MTD for short. And it's not surprising, actually, that in the bricolage or the patchwork self that our young adults find themselves in today, that they actually pulled from a lot of different generations, and their spirituality is this sort of a conglomeration of the last three, the prior three generations, because they're moral. They see religious as being a place for morality. Well, they're not always moral, but according to church standards, they look at the church and or the religious system, and they say, hey, religion is there to tell us what is right and wrong. It's there for our morality. And when we have children and we want them to be raised morally, we're going to go back. If they will or if they won't, we have yet to determine. They also are very therapeutic. They want to feel good about themselves. They want to feel good about church, and they see church and religion as something that actually allows people to feel better about themselves and feel good about society and make sense of the hard things in society. So it's very therapeutically oriented. And the last thing actually is that they're very deistic. They view God way off there in the sky and say, God is up there, God is real, God is absolutely 100% real, but God is not concerned with my everyday life. So if you look at this generation, you say, well, they're more a liberal generation than it was 20 years ago. Well, yeah, because if you don't view God as being intersecting in your everyday life, then sometimes that sense of who God is and how God functions in your life is no longer there. So what we find is that there's a fragmentation of the last three generations that are sort of surfacing in the millennials. Now, let me pause there before I look at this from the perspective of the church and explain how we got here. And is there any questions?
Okay. What was the longitudinal study we have a question of. What's the name of the longitudinal study?
It's called the National Study of Youth and Religion, and there are 3 books out. The original one was called Soul Searching. They're largely sociological books, although they do in the conclusion actually sort of breaks it down and gives you a summary, which is good. If you want to get into the material and actually think about it from a theological perspective, I would recommend Kenda Creasy-Dean's book, Almost Christian. She was one of the researchers that helped with that, and after the research was done, she ended up writing her own book from a theological perspective of saying this is what's happening, particularly with the mainline church, and that'll help translate. It'll give you the data and give you some conversation points.
Yeah, I'm guessing that was in your bibliography from the APSI workshop.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, so I can email that out to folks in the Presbytery so that they have that too. So I've got that available. Okay, other questions that we got? Anybody else right now?
What time are we done here, by the way?
We've got 25 more minutes at the most.
Okay, I'm gonna move then. Another shift happened from sort of the 1940s to the present, and that was the way the church, really even earlier than that, the way the church understands, or the way that our congregations, our members understand church. And that shift, I like to say, went from pastoral to programmatic to moving to a place of practice. So 3 P's to remember: pastoral, programmatic, and practice. Now, pastoral, if you think about the way the silent generation and the early boomers saw church, it was smaller churches. There was even the larger churches were probably like the church we're looking at here, where one pastor could still be sort of the guide for all. The associate pastor model really wasn't in full swing. Civic involvement from the silent generation made the church able to function without a lot of staff, and so there was a sense of that the pastor was guiding this journey, this pastoral journey of the community. Which is why I say, if you have someone who's from the silent generation and they break a hip and they land in the hospital, it doesn't count if the associate pastor comes, because they want the real pastor. Which as an associate for many years, I had that said to me many times. So saying Yeah, but that's the way they understood that. And now what happened was is that after the war, you had a boom not only in children, but you had a boom in church attendance and the rebuilding of society, and Christianity was trying to reestablish itself as the dominant religion, and people went back to church and the churches were booming. And what before you had, everyone came to the Christian education hour, which sort of, started in the last century as well. And then you had, you had the main worship, and you also had, everyone went here and everyone went here. And then all of a sudden there were too many people to accommodate in the church, but we were in a place where we were building churches. So what do? We swapped them. And we said, okay, half the congregation will go to Sunday school and then to church, and then the other half of the congregation will go to church and then to Sunday school. And it worked. It accommodated everyone without having to build new buildings. But eventually, quite frankly, and sorry for you boomers in the room, the boomers figured out that, hey, I don't have to go to church for 2.5 hours. I can go to church for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I can go to church and I can send my kid to Sunday school. Now that was justifiable to some extent because psychology was all the rage, and people were saying ages and stages, and everyone has to be catered to so that make sure their own needs are met, and make sure that we make sure our youth having doubt questions and our children have exploratory questions. And so we started pulling everyone apart. And we started saying, well, let's do better youth groups. Let's develop children's ministry. Let's do, and we started programming the heck out of the church. And as we started to program, we started to bring more staff on to run the program. And as the staff started coming in, people started to pull back from their commitments to the church in terms of volunteering. And I'm sure you could just play this out in your head, how the whole thing would play out. But we became a programming model where the goal in the midst of the growth of our entire economy and growth in industry, growth in business, growth in this, growth in technology, the church all of a sudden wanted to grow too. We no longer lived in a Christian society. There were all sorts of threats to the church and our morality. So we became this evangelistic engine. And this is how you get the emergence of Billy Graham and many folks like that who were preaching this sort of basic gospel because it needed to be reintroduced in the culture. But it was always in the sense of, we're going to build something and you come to it. And Billy Graham's was, we're going to build an image of the kingdom and heaven and we want you to come to it. Churches said, oh, let's build bigger buildings. And if we build it, they will come. Let's build bigger youth groups. And if we build it, they'll come. And so this mentality said, we're going to program the heck out of the church, and everyone's going to come to the church, and we're going to have this successful church. Well, it worked. And in the 80s and 90s, we saw a massive boom. But the problem is there was something missing in that. There was too focused on the individuality, and the extra generation came in and said, I don't really think that actually works for me. There was a huge surge in the sort of 90s and into the early 2000s, where young adults, Xers, were actually looking to the Catholic Church for spiritual connection. All that's to say, we saw this massive shift where, and we're seeing it now, where programming no longer makes sense. Young adults said, you know what, I don't want a program. I don't want to be sold to. The entire society is selling something to me. I don't want you to pander to me. I don't want you to make a technical change to your church. One of the things I get asked the most when I'm on the road is, hey, what do we have to do to get young adults back in our church? If we have a coffee machine, if we put a guitar, get a guitar, if we put a screen up on the wall, if we do all these things, will our young adults come back? No, because they don't care about technical changes. What the young adults and the millennial generation right now care about is actually the church puts their actions where their words are. That the church actually engages in practices that actually demonstrate good in the culture, not just talk about good from the pulpit and then go back to their cushy lives. So in the Xer and the millennial generation, we moved to a place where we're actually saying, hey, church actually has to say something and do something for us to be a part of it, or we're going to get out of here. Now, there are those of us in the Xers that could be called loyal radicals that we're like, we're going to fight this until we go down. But the millennial generation is largely choosing to leave the church. And I don't think it's because they don't like the institution of the church or the people in the church. They don't have time to be a part of something that doesn't actually work. All of this brings us to the fact of, when you look at a young adult in the search that they're on, they're trying to figure out who they are. And I want to argue that the reason they're trying to say, who am I? The church doesn't fit. It doesn't reflect my values. It doesn't reflect what I want. I want a church that's open. I want a church that shows love. I want a church that, and that may have culture classes. I'm sure it has, and every presbytery has culture classes, in particular in relationship to sexuality and to economics and to foreign policy. But young adults are saying, I want a church that actually is taking action in our culture, that is speaking out against injustice, that is loving those who are marginalized. So the biggest things that we need to do is not really start doing those things for the sake of the young adults, but start doing those things for the sake of the individual, because the young adults are searching for a place to grab onto to say, this is where my identity exists. Now, part of that reason is I want to argue that they were never given or never established an anchor identity. Peter Berger is a sociologist that says there are two types of socialization. There's primary and secondary. Primary is those with who you are closest to. They're the people who the emotional connection mediates the world. Your cosmology, your view of the world, your view of how everything functions comes to your parents and your relatives and those in your church community and those and your parents. You get this vision of the world, who it is, and those are the people that form who you are. And if you have a unified message that forms who those are, that you have a clear identity, you have an anchor established identity. Now that's necessary to move on to the second stage of identity formation, which is secondary socialization. And that's where all these different worldviews come into play and start poking at you. And that starts sort of 7, 8 years old. And actually it could start even earlier today with media. But all through, in particular, sort of climaxes in college where you're just, saturated with all these different worldviews. And what we find in collegiate ministry is that our Christian young people are the worst at articulating their faith. Buddhists know what they believe. Hindus know what they believe. Jews know what they believe. Muslims know what they believe. Christians don't know what they believe. They know the general social cultural tenets of what Christianity is, but they don't have any concept of what they actually believe. And if that's the case, and if again they were saying, hey, then we have totally missed the boat, because we're saying, hey, where are they being formed? Why is that happening? Well, perhaps it's because for the last 30 to 40 years, they've been formed in something that people call the one-eared Mickey Mouse. So if you imagine in my head, back up here, I'm in Mickey Mouse here, and this is Mickey Mouse's ear. I like to call it the Van Gogh Mickey Mouse. So you can imagine a little blood to it. So one-eared Mickey Mouse, what happened was when we made that shift and we started doing all that programming, we took everyone was in this body originally, the main corporate body of the church, Mickey's head. And we started doing youth group out here and children's ministry out here and college ministry out here and Sunday school out here. And we started thinking, hey, this is all they need. We're supposed to start it as a supplement, but hope they're enjoying it so much. Let's just do all of our peer-oriented formation out here. Well, when you're searching for identity, you're going to get it, but you're going to get some of it from out here. And so if a young person's identity in their anchor years and in their secondary socialization years were completely formed in this ear, and then they get to the point where they graduate from college and we're saying, why aren't they coming back in the church? Well, why would they, when their entire understanding of spiritual formation is out here in the ear, not here in the face? It's asinine to think that a young adult will return to a community that was never theirs to begin with. And we have been operating on that assumption for the last 40 or 50 years, that we'll just have to make sure the kids have fun in church, and somehow that translates to spiritual formation. And what we're witnessing in our culture today is that we were dead wrong. And we've got to reverse that trend. Now, I'm not saying that all peer-oriented ministry is bad. And I think it's necessary. I think there are developmental differences. I think we need to address those. What I'm saying is that peer-oriented ministry, children's ministry, youth ministry, Sunday school, cannot and should never have been the primary way we form our young people. We have got to reverse this trend, or we're just going to contribute to the same problem year after year after year, and we're never going to see the change. We're only going to see the demise of the church. Because they need that anchor identity, and that anchor identity has to come here within the intergenerational body of the church, so they can see all those different levels, so that when a 5-year-old says, how do I know that God is real? Because everyone that I'm emotionally connected to, everyone that I stand with on Sunday morning, everyone that recites the Apostles' Creed on Sunday as a part of their belief, or sings these hymns, or listens to this sermon, or gives money in the plate, these are the people I belong to. This is my identity. Horace Bushnell, the last century, said we ought to raise our children in such a way that they know themselves only as a Christian. So that means that we need to get rid of this whole notion that we need to raise our children in such a way that they can make a decision for themselves because we want it to stick. That does not work. That is an erroneous idea. Giving our children nothing from the very beginning makes it...
Hang on.
Almost impulse of the patchwork self. When we fail to give them an anchor identity...
Just take a step back to where you said when you give children nothing from the beginning.
If we give children nothing to anchor that identity from the very beginning, then they have David Elkind calls it a patchwork self, where they're piecing bits and pieces together until they arrive on the shores of adulthood, and they don't really have any idea who they are. So it shouldn't surprise us when we talk about young adults these days, that young adults often talk about expressing their identity or finding their identity. They spend their 20s, and sometimes even in their early 30s, trying to figure out who they are. They change their persona on Facebook and MySpace and Instagram, and they project images of who they are. And we all do this in many ways, but it is most prominent with the millennials because they can, because they're trying to figure out who they are. At the core of this, we find that they just don't have this sense of anchor identity. And if you don't have that anchor identity that defines you as a Christian, then you have a far greater difficult time figuring out that later in life. So what that says is that we have to take seriously the spiritual formation of our children. There are 3 theories I'm going to throw at you. 2, imagine concentric circles. So one circle and then another one around, another one around. Situated learning theory says that we actually learn to belong to a community, to feel like we're members of a community, to feel like we have connections and we're a valid member of a community when we move from the outside of a circle to the inside. We move from an outsider to an old timer, so to speak. Not by reading, not by just hanging out in the back of the church, not by watching, not by doing our own thing in another community out here in the ear, but by actually participating in the core values of the core practices of that church. So the things that are central to that. So by your increased participation in the most essential and the most valuable practices of the church, you move to the center of the formation. Now, when all of the practices of our youth and children happen out here in children's ministry and youth ministry, we neglect the fact that at some point they're going to need to draw upon and participate in the practices of the center of the church. And you know what? I understand you don't want your kids to be bored in church. I don't want your kids to be bored in church either. Or maybe that's a preaching problem, not a kid problem. Because the reality is many of us as adults sit and are bored to death in church. So, but it doesn't have to be that way, because we need to stop looking at church from a 50s mentality that says that it's a space that we communicate right doctrine. That's a Platonic ideal. If I teach you what is good, you will go and do what is good. That worked for the silent generation that said there's a right and the wrong, and our civic duty is to do what's right. That kind of worked for the boomer generation, except for the fact that they're like, yeah, we'll take those and we're going to do them differently. Forget the extra generation, but the millennials are just saying, we live in an era where you can't tell me what's right. If you want to show me what's right, if you want to show me what's faithful, if you want to show me what's good, then show me, invite me to participate alongside of you. And by that participation, by that activity, by that collaboration, their understanding of what is right is formed. So that means that what we do is found in the practices, and those practices that we have to do to move to the center of the community need to be clear and defined so that young people can move from the exterior to the interior. 3rd learning identity theory, communal memory theory. It's on the bibliography, Paul Connerton. It's a fascinating idea. I studied it when I was researching Taizé, and the idea behind it was that you have all these 10,000 or 100,000 pilgrims in Taizé. They go home to their 100,000 locations around the world, to their homes, and they want to remember Taizé. And in all my interviews and all my research, everyone's like, I want to remember Taizé. I did this to remember Taizé, and I got kind of sick of it. I'm like, why do you want to remember Taizé? Get on with your life. But what I realized in that was that they said they remembered Taizé when they were singing the Taizé chants, or in a Taizé prayer, or on the Taizé website, or looking at pictures of Taizé. And this led me to a communal memory theory that basically says when we have an instance where we encounter in particular ritualized practices or behaviors, that previous experience with those behaviors and those ritualized practices travel through time and space and actually imbue the current experience of that practice with more meaning and significance. So that means that someone in Taizé can be here and they can sing and they can have a great time in Taizé, and then 6 months later they can be over here in the United States at a Taizé service singing, and the experience they had in Taizé through time and space teleports and actually makes the meaning of what they do more significant. And this is why, if nothing else, the intergenerational congregation must exist, because the very practices are at the core of that, should be ingrained in a child's psyche and understanding of who we are as a body from the very beginning. They should be taking the Eucharist from the very beginning. If they can eat, they can take the Eucharist. And I know someone's going, oh, but they don't understand. Well, show me an adult who truly understands the Eucharist, and I'll show you a kid who should take it. But what I'm saying in this is that these kids need to be a part of this from the very beginning. They need the rituals and the practices of the church, because I know we don't want to indoctrinate our kids, but you know what? Everyone else in every other religion does this, and this is what is sustaining their faith. Yes, the Holy Spirit works within the way we function, but clearly the efforts that we have made over the last 30 to 40 years in terms of youth and children's ministry are not working, because if they did, our young people would be with us in the body. I'm going to stop there. There's a few other things, but I'm sure we're getting close to time, and I want to give some space if anyone has any questions.
Okay, yeah, we've got about 5 minutes, so what questions do we have in the room? Otherwise, I'm gonna forge ahead. We don't have anybody with one, but I've got one for you, in the sense that with this identity formation and Christian formation, has one of the problems also been that, for the most part, families have farmed them out and given the church responsibility for spiritual formation, and it's not happening in the home. So in the sense of millennials matching up what you do and what you say, there's not a connection between church and home. We go to church,
Yes.
we do stuff there, but we don't do that at home, kind of thing.
And again, this was, and I don't want to blame the boomers for everything, although I kind of am. Not really.
Yeah.
But yes, because what happened is that with the rise of the education movement from the early 1900s, 1920s on, in the development of adolescence in 1920 by Stanley Hall, this idea that this moratorium period during the high school age, it became that you send your children. It used to be that kids went to school when they were out in the field working all the summer, and they went to some school in the winter because there was less work to do. Well, then it became that's just the cycle of how we run, but we need to make sure that the job after the war, First World War, was let's get our kids in school. So we see this boom in education. And at some point we had in our mindset, in order to have our kids formed educationally, we have to send them off. Well, this crept into the psyche of the 1950s and the really 1940s, and before that, we need to send our kids to be educated, and it spilled into our understanding of the church. And as boomers started pursuing two careers and started living an instant lifestyle by microwaves and all the other technologies that shortened the things that we needed to do, young people came to a place where they said, you know what? The church has that. They just developed a program for it. They hired a person who specialized for that. Well, I don't have to do that. Why would I do that when a specialist can be given the opportunity to do that? And little by little, it crept away from the family, and we stopped doing those things in the family, and we started relegating to the church. But there was an orange curriculum, the study that shows all these little dots of the times that a youth minister has an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at most a week to form your child in the faith. And if you're not doing anything at home as a congregation or as a body, well, then what? I mean, if we send our kids to school for 2 hours a week, how educated do you think they would be? And couple that with the fact that honestly, a lot of people don't like church anymore because they feel like it's empty. It doesn't mean anything. And if it doesn't fulfill the boomer understanding of the therapeutic Christianity, therapeutic individualism, they hop to another church, and they hop to another church, and they hop to another church until they find something that feeds them. As opposed to this, the silent generation that's like, I'm going to stick it out and I'm going to serve my duty, and I'm going to sit here, I'm going to fold bulletins till I keel over, because that is my duty. But all of that to say is we need to bring to a place where all of those generations coalesce in the same place. Those of you in the silent generation, those of you with gray hair in the room, you have I think one of the biggest keys to this. We need to get your wisdom, we need to get your journeys, we need to get your stories, we need to get your faithfulness back into all aspects of the church. You've been relegated to the side because you didn't grow up as digital natives in the same way Xers and really millennials, being the only current generation that grew up in other than the current one. But it's the first time in culture where a 17-year-old can know more about something and be more proficient in something than a 67-year-old. And that's threatening to that tradition of handing down knowledge and handing down and journeying together. We need to reclaim that. We need to start interacting with one another. We need to start saying, and let me be clear, intergenerational is not multi-generational. The church was multi-generational in the 50s and 40s. Everyone was there. They weren't necessarily doing it, but we don't have time just to get everyone in the same room like a potluck and everyone brings their own stuff and divides up. What we need to do is actually ask what it means to have the formation that we experience be able to be tapped in by all. And here's the key. It's not about what you learn. It's about how you learn. I can teach you till I'm blue in the face what baptism is, but if you don't learn that alongside other generations, then you're just learning it for your own assimilation of knowledge rather than the experience of saying, this is who we are as a people. We need to move away from moral formation and closer towards identity formation. That's the reason Jews go through the story of the Old Testament, our Old Testament, every 3 or 4 times a year. They do this in their holy seasons. Why? Because their identity is the most important thing to them, and the morality flows out of it. I went off on a tangent, but
Yeah, well, we've got.
Okay.
In the millennial search for self, when a millennial finally finds himself, how does that change his life?
Did you were you able to hear that, Jason?
I got bits and pieces. Can you repeat it for me?
Yeah, let me see if I get it. When a millennial
Finds himself,
finds himself or herself,
herself,
yeah.
how does it change their perception
How
of
does it-
reality?
How does it change their perception of reality? So when these millennials find themselves, how does that now change their perspective?
Because they're actually, ironically, in the last 50 years, we've seen the emergence of a new type of personhood, if you will. And it's to use David Elkind's language, it's a patchwork self or a bricolage. It's a collage of all these different worldviews. They tend to define themselves by not what they're for, but what they're against. But what happens is when they find someone who has when you've been raised in an environment where everyone is your own age and going through the same thing in life, when you look for spiritual formation, you're going to look for that. I don't critique older generations and the silent generation who say, we want hymns. Don't get rid of our hymns. They're too important to us. Why would an older generation not want hymns when their entire spiritual formation of the vast majority of their life had hymns as the central music that carried them through? That is their spirituality, and we need to honor and respect that, and we need to understand that's a part of it. That doesn't mean we can't, figure out a way to sort of have everyone present actually have something that connects with them. So it means that needs to be flexibility on this side. But the reality is that they're formed in that identity, and they're formed in that certain way. And young adults will be formed. I think I lost my train.
It's okay. We've kind of hit that time barrier. So we will look forward to seeing you live next February. It's a
Bob,
long
can I
way
make
off.
just one last comment?
Go ahead, go.
Just to close, this is a daunting task, because I'm not saying you should dismantle your youth ministries or your children's ministries. But what I'm saying is that everything you do in your children and youth ministry should center around the idea that an intergenerational space builds a communal memory that leads to a communal identity. That means that when that child, and the goal would be that when a child graduates from high school and heads off on their own, that they have such a profound experience of Christian community that nothing they find in the outside world can replace it. And when they truly experience that in communities, when they experience that grace and that mercy and that forgiveness and love and that action, that social justice, they won't run from it. They won't run away from it. They'll run toward it, and they'll bring their folks with it. Not because the goal is to grow the church, but the goal is to increase God's love around this world.
There you go.
On that, we'll see you in February.
Nailed it. Great. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Maybe.